Well, hello, friends, and welcome to the August 9th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Engagement Director, and today's episode is brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And I want to set the stage before we jump in. So we're recording at noon on Monday, August 9th. The governor has called a second special session after Democrats opposing the voter suppression bills fled for Washington, D.C. to break quorum in the first called special session. So the legislature reconvened beginning on Saturday at noon. The House came in and did not have a quorum, so they adjourned until 4 o'clock today, Monday, hoping that enough members would return. We do not yet have word as of 12:02 on Monday about whether or not there will be a quorum this afternoon, but by the time you listen, you'll probably have the answer to that question. So we'll continue to wait and see on the House side. On the Senate side, they did begin business. They had committee hearings Saturday and Sunday, and the State Affairs Committee is taking public testimony on the voting bill as we record. So Josh won't be able to be with us today as he is monitoring that hearing. So watch this space, watch texasimpact.org for more information. Join our rapid response team to receive time-sensitive emails. For now, y'all, I guess the message is the same as it's been for the last few months. Keep calling your representative, keep calling your senator to let them know that you support voting rights and encourage them to do the same. Make those telephone calls, tag them on social media. There are Texas Impact resources available. We have a link that I'll try to post in the chat, but spoiler, the easiest way to find it is search for Texas Impact Elections. And about halfway down the page under number 2, you can see our analysis of the bills that were filed in the first special session. Again, spoiler alert, those talking points are still the same. If you have questions, you can always email me at scott@texasimpact.org. But for today's program, I am excited to talk with a good friend of the program, native Texan, Sister Quincy Howard, who is a government relations advocate with Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice and a leader in the Faithful Democracy, coalition of religious organizations working to protect democracy, including many of the member organizations that you and your faith community belong to. We talked with Sister Quincy last summer about federal voting legislation, and she is one of our go-tos on that topic. But we're also inviting her today to the conversation because she helped organize a meeting of national faith leaders with Texas Democrats last week in D.C. So we'll talk about that meeting and the next steps and work for voting rights legislation at the federal level. So with that, Sister Quincy, did I get all of that right? Thanks again for joining us.
That was perfect. Yes, it was.
Sweet.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I am always happy to welcome back native Texans who are doing the important work in D.C. But why don't we start out with just a reminder for folks who aren't familiar with Network and Faithful Democracy. Tell us some about those two important organizations.
Sure. So I wear 2 hats. The first one I wear is with Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, which it is a multi-issue advocacy organization that it essentially focuses on federal policies that we believe reflect Catholic social teaching. So it was founded by Catholic sisters in the early 70s. It is a very inclusive organization, rooted in our values, but open to all. And we have really been leaning into our democracy portfolio in the last few years as we've been seeing some of the really disturbing trends on a federal level as well as on a state level. And through that work, I really have branched out into coalition building, which is where Faithful Democracy comes in. We have many national, it started out as national faith-based advocacy organizations, as well as the sort of advocacy branches of like the National Council of Churches and sort of the congregational advocacy branch. Before the 2020 election, with Faithful Democracy and our advocacy related to the election and how sort of policy and get out the vote all came together, for the 2020 election, we really started reaching out and forming relationships with state partners in key states like Texas Impact, and have continued to do that with our advocacy, again, looking at federal legislation, but bringing in state partners in a strategic way as we're able to. And right now with Faithful Democracy, we are very, very focused on Before the People Act, which is still very much in play. Don't let anybody tell you different. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, in a bit. But that's the gist of the Faithful Democracy Coalition. It is interfaith. And yeah, I think that's a good picture.
It is, and it's good to know because we trade emails all the time, and it's good to know that the advocates who are working so hard in Texas on state level issues and also federal stuff are able to be matched up with folks who are doing similar work in other states. So we really appreciate the convening work that you do there. And the information that you share. So let's jump in. I'm really interested in this conversation that you had last week, and we were able to talk a little bit before we jumped on. But I mentioned in the open that special session number 1 in Texas was cut a little short because Texas Democrats spent about the last month in D.C. breaking quorum to prevent these voter suppression bills from passing at the state level. And they've spent that time meeting with Washington players. They've met with partisans. They've met with activists. And obviously, if they weren't in D.C., we would have been having meetings in their communities with Texans of faith, talking about the bills here in the state and the impact that they have on our communities from a faith perspective. So we're especially grateful that you were able to convene some faith leaders at the federal level, some of our national advocacy partners that have joined us on Weekly Witness that our people of faith in Texas would relate to in their denominational or faith groups. And so you were able to convene some of those national faith leaders with some of the Democrats on the coalition or in the group that's in DC who are really ingrained in their own faith communities for a conversation. So first of all, thanks for organizing. Second, how did that conversation go?
It was very meaningful, is what I can say. I really appreciated Texas Impact actually brought it to my attention that there was a cohort within the broader Texas Democrat legislators that was deeply rooted in their faith, some of them clergy. And I had heard a couple of them speak at a rally for John Lewis's anniversary and here in DC. And it was pretty clear that he was a preacher, right? So it was helpful to have those dots connected for me. And also to know that Texas Impact has relationships with many of these legislators, especially the ones rooted in their faith, which makes perfect sense. And so thanks to your help, I was able to pull together, I don't know that I would call them as much faith leaders, as much as leaders within the faith advocacy realm at the national level. So we had like National Council of Jewish Women, we had the RAC, we had National Council of Churches, the Presbyterian Church, and some of our key really involved national partners that were super excited at the opportunity to meet some of these Texas legislators, because we've all been paying close attention to what they're doing, how they're speaking out, and how courageous their actions have been to take the kind of bold steps that they have to try to protect voting rights in Texas. So it was sort of a last minute ad hoc meeting. And at first I went straight to the strategic, like, okay, what are we going to do with this meeting? And should we have a press conference? Because that's the mode that I'm in. But as I thought about it more and got a little more context about how their visit in DC has been going, it dawned on me that really maybe what we are called to do as a national coalition is just to provide a safe space for them in Washington, D.C., to have a different conversation about their work, about their actions. And so I made it very clear to our national partners, and I think also to the state legislators, that we wanted this to be a space about introduction, about community, about relationship building, and to learn from each other, right? And that's what it was. And it was very different from the kinds of meetings that I find myself in these days, which was quite refreshing. And my impression was that it was very refreshing to them as well as to our national partners as well. The feedback that I got was great. I think where we are left is not quite knowing what to do with it, but feeling very energized by the conversation.
That's interesting. So maybe a little of your you drew this distinction earlier that is important, talking about leaders in faith advocacy groups versus faith leaders. But I imagine some of those same folks also were able to put some pastoral hats on for some fellow wanderers. So you mentioned that you had a chance to learn from each other. What was that conversation like? What were you able to learn from each other?
Well, with the state legislature's introductions of themselves, it was really refreshing to hear them immediately go into how their faith had led them to the point that they are, and how those values undergirded the actions they've taken, their vocation as lawmakers in the state legislature. And also for me, one of the learnings was that there was a solid representation of, you could call them fallen away Catholics, former Catholics that had found new homes, right? And I think that between our national partners as well as the state legislators, one thing that we really was part of the conversation, even if it wasn't explicit, was the tension between the sort of institutional church, whether that's Catholic or whatever religion it is, and the values and the deeply rooted faith that undergirds the way that we move through our lives. So that to me was a very special commonality that we had. And I think another thing that sort of perspective that I feel like we learned from each other was how the national advocacy and this sort of very, how should you say it? Like overarching overview, big picture that tries to hold it all, that is federal legislation, is so different from Texas legislators' perspective on what the state is dealing with, and also their constituents are dealing with related to voting rights, but that we all share the same concerns and are all part of the same fight. So those were, I think, some of the themes that really stood out to me in the conversation.
I want to pivot to that in just a second. Before we start jumping into state versus federal legislation, any quotable quotes, memorable moments that kind of were ingrained in your mind coming out of that?
Yes, there was one legislator that an African-American, a very strong woman. I'm not going to say names because I don't want to divulge anything that might not be comfortable, but she was very clear about her call and the need to have white allies be more visible on the front lines, so to speak, right? That we are seeing civil rights leaders emerging, new ones in 2021, as well as the same civil rights leaders that were in the original fights in the 1960s around voting rights. And that there are clear trends that these are people of color, the ones that are being the most bold, risking arrest and putting themselves literally on the front lines and being present in a visible and strong way. And she really called on the group, many of whom are white people, to see what we can do and how we can urge our own networks, from the national level, to step up and be more visible and not necessarily engaged, but visible as allies. So that was a challenge that she posed to us, which was a welcome challenge, and I think one that we are aware of, but it never hurts to be reminded.
That's interesting you say that, because we've had both legislators and advocates on over the course of the last few months, and I've been doing this for a while, like advocate to advocate, right? I don't know that I've ever had more guests on the program kind of challenge us to get people of faith, to get congregations active, and we've had legislators and again, people like you mentioned who've fallen away from faith but have been reinvigorated by people who are participating in things like this. We've been challenged a lot of times to get involved in this, and so I'm feeling that, right? Especially as a white person of faith, hearing from people of color calling us to get more engaged. I wonder if there's anything else that kind of challenged you or challenged the other faith leaders in that meeting.
Well, I mean, one thing, the challenge that I took away was, how do we build on this, right? And I think everyone was challenged by that, because it did feel like such a meaningful conversation. And it was an hour, right? So everything is time bound, and that's really challenging when there's a conversation that is rooted in something deeper and that is about building community. How do you continue those, especially in the fast-paced environment and sort of all the distractions these days? So that is something that I am, and I'm sure my partners are continuing to think about, is what to do with that conversation and these hopefully new relationships that we will carry forward. One of the things that stood out to me that had not dawned on me before, that was pointed out by one of the Texas legislators, was how their perception anyway was that, they were a very small subset of a much larger group, as you well know, that came to DC, many of whom are progressives, are not rooted in their faith, don't have a faith tradition, are agnostic or atheist, and also very sort of live in that world of Texas legislation, and don't necessarily look far out of that world. And the perception was that this visit that they took to Washington, D.C., again, I'm saying visit as if they're on vacation, but you know what I mean, that their time in Washington, D.C. and their experience and their conversations in D.C. has really been something of a conversion moment for them, not so much in a religious sense, so to speak, but in recognizing that they are a piece of a much bigger puzzle, and that they are part of something bigger than they maybe had recognized before they took this bold action.
Nice. Well, thanks again for organizing that piece of it. I'm wondering, my guess is that you spend most of your time focusing on federal legislation. I'm wondering if the conversation with these state leaders helped you kind of better understand what was happening in states, and I guess, at this point, especially states throughout the South.
I don't think that this conversation, we did not really get into any weeds on policy, quite honestly. If anything, we talked about sort of how there is overlap especially in the voting rights realm between federal and state legislation. So we didn't so much get into those weeds, except that at one point I wanted to make it very clear to them, and I gather it already was, that we are solidly pushing Plan B, right? That we so applaud their approach to Plan A, which is to avoid these terrible laws in Texas, and that we are here to get their back as federal advocates rooted in faith to make sure that there's a stopgap there so that it doesn't come to fruition.
Right. That's why they went to DC, right? We'll keep talking to the Weekly Witness community about how we can help prevent voter suppression bills in Texas. But at the end of the day, there's going to have to be federal action, or we're going to keep seeing bills like this. So let's shift our focus that direction. Help us understand what the current federal legislation is that we should be looking at, and what's the path forward for that.
Yeah, there are two key bills that we are watching and that are pivotal in having federal protections. The first one, which is, it has not been reintroduced yet, is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And that is the bill that would restore the full protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now that has been introduced every session since the Shelby ruling and the Supreme Court trying to restore those protections. There was a little bit of a monkey wrench thrown into the gears in July when the Supreme Court had their ruling on Brnovich, which essentially weakened significantly Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The Shelby ruling was about Section 5, which was preclearance. Section 2 is about the ability of communities and parties to challenge rules after they have been passed. So that means that essentially the legislators at the federal level are working to incorporate language to protect Section 2 from the Voting Rights Act before they're able to reintroduce that bill. So that's likely to move later on in the fall, and we will be watching closely. The other bill, which is front and center right now and has been rumored on multiple occasions this spring and summer to be dead, it is not dead. It is the For the People Act. So that is S1. And as a reminder, it has passed the House already. HR 1 passed the House back in March, I believe, and has been moving forward in the Senate ever since. Until it was stalled in June by the filibuster. So it was not the first piece of legislation to get stalled by the filibuster. That would have been the January 6th commission, which was pathetic, but also helpful in the sense that it helped make clear to some of our more moderate Democratic friends, the Mansions and the Cinemas in the Senate, that there is not a good faith negotiating partner on the Republican side. And that is what we're continuing to see. So the bill has been sitting, languishing in the Senate since the filibuster at the end of June, I believe. And Schumer has made a commitment that he is going to bring it back to the floor before the Senate goes on recess. So all of us advocates have been waiting and sort of like, okay, Schumer, we're ready for that bill. What's the plan? And late last week, we had some very, very encouraging signs. Senator Manchin has begun to engage around the bill and voice what he would like to see pass in the bill, which is quite honestly the vast majority of the bill. So we've been pleased. And over the weekend, there's been a subgroup of senators, including Merkley and Klobuchar and Manchin and Schumer, sort of some key decision makers there that have been working together to come up with a compromise. Keep in mind, this is a Democratic compromise, not a bipartisan compromise, because the Republicans have refused to engage on any level. So we anticipate that this compromise version is going to come out any minute now. I had hoped it would come out before the day started. And another sort of added bonus to this regrouping and adjustment of the bill is that they are now looking to, I think, incorporate some provisions to protect against election subversion efforts, which have been, those would be like a state legislator that is trying to pull powers from election administrators who are nonpartisan and be able to have power over calling elections and which votes should count. So it's sort of an after the fact undermining of election integrity, quite honestly. So we are very hopeful that this bill, the revised For the People Act, when the language is introduced and we learn what is in it, that we will be able to support it. And that Schumer will do his best to bring it to a vote by the end of the week or before they go on recess. The real question is what's going to happen with the filibuster. The two possibilities. One is that Schumer will also come with a strategy to deal with the filibuster so that this bill can pass. That is ideal dream scenario. The other option is that Schumer uses this as an opportunity to demonstrate that there is enough Democratic support on this bill to potentially pass it. But it gets filibustered again, and then it has to wait until they come back to session to ultimately find out what the strategy is to remove the filibuster as the obstacle.
Any chance preclearance or anything from the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, did I get that right, can make its way into the For the People Act compromise?
No, because I don't think so. Because the vast majority of that bill, if you remember, the Supreme Court struck down the Section 5 preclearance based on outdated formula for which states and which jurisdictions needed to get preclearance. So it's a much more complicated process that's involved in building a record to undergird the formula that they apply in that bill so that it will not be struck down again, hopefully, by a Supreme Court. And there was a very intentional decision with the For the People Act not to try to roll that into the bill because it's just too complicated and needs to travel on its own track.
All right. So potential for news on the For the People Act this week, probably September, on the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. I got that right. So that's our path moving forward. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, there's going to be some action this week on S1, and we'll see where that leads. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, September, potentially October.
This fall sometime. If folks are wanting to make telephone calls today, what's the ask? To their members of Congress. I already told people they should be calling their state legislator, state representative, and senator, but what are the congressional calls folks will be making today?
Yes, they want to call their senator, their U.S. senator. That is where things are happening. And I think really there's a general ask and then a little bit of a more specific ask based on this sort of revised version. The general ask is if you have a senator that is a Democrat, urge them to support the bill. All of them except one have actually co-sponsored the bill. I won't name, I'll name him, it's Manchin. He hasn't co-sponsored the bill yet. So to do whatever it takes to move the bill forward in the legislative process, including getting in line with whatever leadership decides to do about the filibuster, making sure that whatever the strategy is to remove that as a barrier, they are on board and they will get behind it. A little bit of a more specific ask, if for those who are really into policy, would be I think the sort of most endangered reform provision in the For the People Act, now that they are doing this sort of reworking of it, is the small donor matching campaign finance reform. And that is essentially setting up an alternative way for candidates to raise money to run for office. And it is not funded by big money, not funded by dark money. It is funded by small donors and a public matching that would amplify the voice of your average person. And that matching fund is actually financed by a fee that is added to corporate malfeasance wrongdoers. So it is a kind of a poetic way of channeling money from the bad actors to amplify the voice of your regular folks.
All right. Well, any other closing thoughts for today or shameless plugs you'd like to leave us with?
No, I don't have any shameless plugs. Just I would encourage folks that now is the time with this federal advocacy to push it forward, and we all benefit from it, including Texans, Arizonans, all of those who have endangered election systems. It behooves all of us to really put in the advocacy and the activism at this time.
Amen to that. Well, Sister Quincy, thank you so much for the time today. And I know I've told you multiple times, but you're one of our DC heroes. So thanks for the work you're doing every day on behalf.
I so appreciate the work you're doing as well. Thank you for having me.
And one day post-COVID, I do look forward to getting to hang out with you back in Texas once, we start gathering in large groups again.
Amen.
But so thanks again for all you do. And friends, thank you so much for tuning in today. I will echo the call that now is the time, both at the state and federal level, to raise your voice as Texans of faith is people of faith who care about democracy, who care about voting rights. We have to speak up. We have to show up. So let's do that work. Texas Impact is here to resource your work. Go to texasimpact.org/elections, or just Google Texas Impact elections. We have a lot of resources about the special sessions and about voting in Texas. So check out those and make sure you're sharing them with your friends, with your congregations. And while you're at it, go ahead and let them know that they should watch this weekly witness episode. Share the podcast, subscribe, like, do all of those things. And remember that if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members by going to texasimpact.org/join. Friends, it was so great to see so many of you at the Capitol last month rallying for voting rights, but that work continues. Make sure that you and your congregation are doing everything you can to educate, empower, and inform your communities to stand up, speak out for voting rights. So now's the time. Let's get to work.